Debate. The honourable member for Renfrew, Nipissing, Pembroke.
Madam Speaker, well, I believe the member for Humber Creek, Black Creek provided the title for this speech. Corruption, corruption, corruption. And the member for Edmonton Griesbach gave the theme and the reason for the whole debate, and that is to pay for the consequences of bad actions. Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to rise on the behalf of the industrious and innovating residents of Renfrew, Nipissing, Pembroke, and today we are debating a very important motion. The motion would direct the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs to study the government's cover-up of their corruption at the Sustainable Development Technology Corporation. There's really not much actually up for debate. The facts are clear, well established. The former head of the Sustainable Development Technology Corporation, or SDTC for short, told the government that appointing a person who had received money from SDTC to be chair of the board was a bad idea. The government ignored the advice and appointed the Liberal donor anyhow. Then, to absolutely no one's surprise, the board started handing out grants to companies they had a stake in. Naturally, the employees at SDTC started to feel uncomfortable with the actions of the board. These employees carefully documented the conflicts of interest and followed the proper procedures for reporting to the ministry responsible for SDTC. These employees followed the rules and were granted a meeting with the Deputy Minister. The employees explained the situation. The Deputy Minister said it was worse than the sponsorship scandal, ad scam. He said the Minister would flip his lid. Unfortunately, the Deputy Minister had placed too much faith in the Minister. Rather than flipping his lid, the Minister tried to put the lid on it. Of course, this government wants to cover it up. They were explicitly and directly and clearly warned that appointing this particular Liberal donor to be board chair was a problem. And not only did this government ignore the warning lights, it ignored the warning signs and the warning bells. The Liberals ignored all of it and appointed even more compromised people to the board. That's like warning a bartender to stop selling drinks to minors, then he gives them away for free. According to the Auditor General, there are at least $400 million tax dollars involved and 186 conflicts of interest that we know of. Madam Speaker, as I mentioned, this isn't really a debate. Those are already the established facts. Just like the ruling that the Speaker issued, finding the Liberals had violated an order from this House to hand over the documents to the RCMP. Now the Liberals' junior partner is complaining that all of this is distracting the government from pursuing its socialist agenda. Once again, the NDP reveal they do not understand the role of Parliament is to hold the government accountable. This is our #1 job, and it's not just for opposition members. Every member not in cabinet is supposed to hold the government to account. Maybe if the Liberal backbench spent more time doing that and less time spreading conspiracy theories about hidden agendas on social media, this government might not be so badly out of touch. Madam Speaker, this motion is not distracting Parliament from its work. This is its work. Exactly. If the issue is getting legislation passed, it's the Liberal cover-up and the Liberal corruption that's the problem. That and the NDP enablers. Enabling this corruption is the problem. Not pulling it out at the roots is the problem. Liberal corruption and incompetence is a real problem, and it impacts the lives of Canadians just as much, if not more, than any single piece of legislation before this House. The founder of an exciting technology company in my riding has informed me that he may have to move his company to the United States. He'll be taking the high-tech jobs they created with them. So there we have collateral damage. How much of that was lost that we know of? We have a productivity crisis making Canadians poorer every day. Yet the NDP Socialist Coalition is driving away exactly the types of companies we need to tackle this crisis. This government has spent the last 9 years piling straw onto the backs of small and medium-sized business. But for this particular company in my riding, it is SDTC. And this is why the government is holding the government accountable is so critical. Liberal corruption and incompetence will cost people their livelihoods. It doesn't matter if you're 80 kilometers from Ottawa or 800. Decisions taken here have an impact out there. The Liberals decided to appoint a donor to be the chair of the SDTC down here, and hundreds of jobs are lost out there. The only person who should have lost his job over the scandal at SDTC is the Liberal minister, whose lid remains firmly unflipped. I can see that calling for a Liberal minister to resign is being met with eye rolls across the aisle. And I know that when Liberals hear a Conservative calling for a minister to resign, they'll just dismiss it. They think we're just trying to score points, because that is, to them, the point of a parliamentary democracy. When a government makes a mistake, our job is to point it out. When something goes wrong in a department, the minister is supposed to resign. That way, a new minister can come in and clean house. Not only that, but the new minister is also strongly incentivized to keep a close eye on what's going on in their department. Yet I'd not wager a single current minister even knows half the programs being run underneath them. Jean Chrétien tried to kill the idea of responsible government in our country, but this Prime Minister, with his outspoken admiration of communist dictators, took it off life support and smothered it with a pillow. Common sense Conservatives will resurrect it, will restore democracy, responsibility, and accountability. And those aren't just sound bites. As I mentioned earlier, this scandal has nothing to do with any of my constituents, yet some of them are paying the price for it. Had there been a minister who listened to the advice of the outgoing SDTC president, none of this would have happened. Good governance is good politics. By demanding accountability of our ministers, Conservatives get quality ministers. Better ministers are better at passing Conservative legislation and advancing Conservative policies. Bad governance is bad politics, and this motion is all the proof the Liberals need. None of this would be happening if the minister had done as his deputy predicted and flipped his lid. Everything that transpired at SDTC wasn't just predictable, it was actually predicted. This is a troubling pattern with these progressives. They're warned their bad policy will have a predictably and bad consequence, and then they accuse the policy critics of spreading disinformation. They pass the policy, it goes exactly as miserably as predicted, so they start to gaslight Canadians. Whether it's the Streaming Censorship Act, the News Censorship Act, or the Hug-a-Thug Act, the results are playing out as the critics expected. Less news, less choice, more crime, more chaos. Now, thanks to Liberal corruption and incompetence, Canada will have less sustainably developed technology. The kind of technology that saves lives. The kind of technology that boosts productivity. Developed by the kinds of companies that create jobs and pay taxes Liberals love to spend. Instead, after 9 long, scandal-filled years, all Canada has is more corruption, more debt, more taxes, and more crime. Oh, and thanks to the carbon tax, pushing up the price of food, Canada now has or scurvy too. Yet all we hear from the Liberals is that everything is awesome. That may be true for the shrinking Liberal base of support, but for the rest of us, things are far more awful than awesome. Madam Speaker, this motion is a chance for the Liberals to turn their sinking ship around. Liberals will ignore this advice, but a little humility goes a long way with Canadians. Turn over the documents, sack the minister, and apologize to Canadians. That's just common sense. And while I promise to be brief, there was one more element to this story. Regular viewers of my Facebook live streams may recall this from last June. And to recap, SDTC gives grants and loans to companies developing green technologies. The Liberals had ignored advice from public servants warning them not to appoint Annette Verschuren as chair of the board of directors because Ms. Verschuren owned a company that was getting funding from the SDTC. But despite the warnings from the Liberals, she was appointed as chair. And shortly afterwards, Ms. Verschuren voted to give her company additional money. And she wasn't the only board member that was in a conflict of interest. Fortunately, employees did blow the whistle. The Liberals tried to sweep it under the table, but eventually it was reported to the Globe and Mail. The CBC did several stories on the issue, and it resulted in parliamentary hearings. Ms. Verschuren appeared at the committee, claimed she did nothing wrong, then resigned a few weeks later. Now, if you search Google, you can find dozens of media stories reporting all the details over several months. The Liberals appointed someone to lead an organization which hands out taxpayer money, and that person gave money to her own business in an obvious conflict of interest. So the legacy news media gave it appropriate coverage, Parliament investigated, and the Liberal appointee resigned. Now the legacy media like to point to this type of reporting and arguing that exposing this type of corruption is why the legacy news media is a pillar of democracy and therefore they should receive taxpayer-funded subsidies. So the Liberals listened and have created a whole new slew of funding programs for legacy news media. One of those programs is the Local Journalism Initiative. This program gives media outlets money to hire a local journalist. This program is run by the news media lobbyists. The lobbyists then selected a panel of 7 people to be the judges on who gets the taxpayers' money. The judging panel reviews applications, selects recipients, and decides on funding allocations. And of the 7 judges, 5 are in blatant conflict of interest for having approved funding for their own media outlets. For example, one of the judges, Linda Solomon-Wood, is the CEO and editor-in-chief of the National Observer. The National Observer received funding to hire 3 journalists. Most outlets only got funding for 1 journalist. So, just as with SDTC, we have a group of people in charge of handing out taxpayer money, and they're giving that money to their own companies. We have identical scandals, yet just one news outlet, Blacklock's reporter, has ever mentioned it. The entire legacy media has dropped a cone of silence over this scandal. And the reason they're all covering this Liberal corruption up is because even if they do not receive money from the program, they can profit from it. Part of the program requires that all these taxpayer-provided journalists must share their reporting for free. News outlets can access the database of free articles through the radical far-left outfit called Canada Press. By the way, one of the 7 judges is also the executive director of the Canadian Press. Now the government has released an evaluation of the local journalism initiative. The Liberals give themselves an A+. But that's what happens when you hire the evaluators. More outside consultants were hired by Heritage's Evaluation Directorate to evaluate how well the government is doing at giving away taxpayer money to well-connected special interests. The people getting the government money surprisingly think Liberals are...
I have to interrupt the honourable member, who will have 4 minutes and 30 seconds when we next deal with this issue. Having reached the expiry of the time provided for today's debate, the House will resume consideration on the privilege motion at the next sitting of the House.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Renfrew-Nipissing-Pembroke had 4 minutes and 30 seconds remaining in her debate.
Madam Speaker, for anyone just tuning in now, I'll recap the issue. The Liberals chose a group of well-connected elites to give out money on behalf of the government. Those chosen elite then gave the money to companies they either owned or had a financial interest in. When these acts of blatant corruption were reported to the Liberal minister, they tried to cover it up. Parliament invested the corruption, and this House ordered the government to hand over all documents to the RCMP. This communist-praising Prime Minister decided he didn't need to listen to Parliament. His government refused to hand over all the documents without redactions. So now we're here, debating a motion calling on the government to respect the will of Canadians who elected this Parliament. And we're not going to stop debating this motion until the government hands over the documents. To do anything less means throwing the towel in on parliamentary democracy. Madam Speaker, how do you think this will end? Do you think Canadians are going to rise up in protest that the government's terrible agenda is not sailing through? Do they imagine the Liberal Party base forming a massive convoy of luxury SUVs to come to Ottawa? Do you think a long trail of EVs leaving from Rosedale, the Glebe, and Westmount will come riding to their rescue? That's an adorable little fantasy they have over there, but it's time for a safe supply of reality. Most Canadians oppose this government. They oppose its plan to censor Canadians. They oppose its plan to increase taxes. And they oppose its plan to ban plastic food packaging. They oppose its plan to ban livestock farming. They oppose the preaching, hectoring, and anti-Canadian attitude that comes out of this government. They want this government defeated. It can't happen soon enough. The scandal involving the Liberals' Green Slush Fund is just the tip of the iceberg. As I mentioned in my speech yesterday, the Liberals chose a group of well-connected elites to hand out money on behalf of the government. And those chosen elite then gave the money to companies they either owned or had a financial interest in. Instead of sustainable development technology, we have the local journalism initiative now. One difference between the conflict of interest scandal at SDTC and the conflict of interest scandal with the local journalism initiative is that SDTC is accountable to Parliament through a minister. That's why employees were able to blow the whistle to the deputy minister. The Liberals did not put the local journalism initiative into an independent agency reporting to Parliament. No. Instead, they gave the money to lobbyists, organizations that campaign for the cash in the first place. The lobbyists then appointed the owners and executives of media outlets to hand out the funds to the chosen media outlets. Those owners and executives then gave the cash to their own companies. That would be the same media owners and executives who control the media lobbyist associations. Whether it's SDTC or the local journalism initiative or $1 billion for We Charity, it's always the same thing. The Liberals are handing out other people's money to well-connected Laurentian elite in a circle of self-dealing. Madam Speaker, or Mr. Speaker now, Canadians are sick and tired of this corrupt, incompetent government. They need to hand over the documents to the RCMP. then it's time to call the election Canadians so badly need. Now, I want to quote from my colleague in the other place, Senator Plett, who recently gave a rundown of all this government scandals. Quote, the first scandal in the top three is the SNC-Lavalin affair. This started when the criminals snuck a change into the criminal code into the budget bill to allow the government to make deals with corporations found guilty of corruption. Again, preempting, we know there will be corrupt people, so let's find a way out for them. This came after months of intense lobbying by SNC-Lavalin officials.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Leader of the Government in the House of Commons.
Mr. Speaker, at the very least, I always find my colleagues' speeches interesting, not necessarily factual, but they're interesting, Mr. Speaker. And the question that I have for her is related to her opening statement in terms of trying to report the facts. For example, she indicated that you have the SDTC, which is actually an arm's length from government, I must add, an organization that went awry. She gave the impression that the government did nothing, which is just not true, Mr. Speaker. There were 2 internal investigations. There was, the board has been replaced, and you actually have a freeze of new funding. That's action. Now, Mr. Speaker, the issue before us then is why should we walk over the Charter of Rights in order to solve an appetite of the Conservative Party for their desire for an election when we have the RCMP and the Auditor General expressing concern as to the Conservative tactic that they're using today?
The Honourable Member from Renfrew, Nipissing, Pembroke.
Okay, I don't know what Charter of Rights he thinks are being impeded, but let's go to what he started to ask about their action, or tell us about their actions already being done. Well, they froze things. And in this instance, what's happened in SDTC, which existed since the early 2000s and had run fairly unproblematically until this government took power, providing money to companies who actually provided jobs and grew into multi-million-dollar businesses. Well, by freezing that money, we have several other companies that were ready to launch into other countries as well, based on that income. Instead, they end up having to pay extra taxes and leaving Canada altogether. So that's one of the implications of the actions that was taken. In terms of the documents, we need those. We only know about the $400 million that has been misspent out of $1 billion allocated every year. I know they don't have those pages released, Mr. Speaker, but there's so much more corruption to uncover.
The Honourable Member.
Abbotsford.
Speaker, I appreciated my colleague's speech, and she was interrupted at the end just as she was starting to share with Canadians the large number of scandals that this Liberal government has been engaged in over the last 9 years. Perhaps she wishes to continue, regale us with more and more of these scandals that have brought this government essentially to its knees.
From Renfrew, Nipissing, Pembroke.
So I mentioned the SNC-Lavalin, and I thank my colleague for being able to continue this. But all these scandals, this litany of scandals, from the several allegations of corruption of officials in Canada around the globe against engineering construction firm SNC-Lavalin, the Prime Minister himself applying pressure to the former Attorney General, Jody Wilson-Raybould, to sign an agreement to let SNC-Lavalin off the hook. These are a few of many reasons why Canadians no longer trust this government. And the only solution is to call a carbon tax election so the people of Canada can throw them out and make the decision known for everyone.
Let's do it.
Questions et commentaires.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Berthier-Masquinongé. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Somewhat ironically, My Conservative colleague stole my question. I was also going to ask her to continue with the long list of scandals. That's kind of funny because that doesn't happen often. That's really the question I was going to ask. Now I'd like for her to talk about how, the work of the House is being blocked, but there are a number of reasons why we ought to doubt the current Liberal approach. Does the member not believe that it's now time to vote on the motion so that we can force the government to hand over the documents? Then we can move on to something else on the agenda.
Nipissing Pembroke.
The fact that one of my colleagues in the bloc would have to ask why we even need to continue demanding these documents gives pause to let me explain further the SNC-Lavalin situation. The former Attorney General was not of the opinion that SNC-Lavalin met the criteria in the provisions added to the criminal code just months before, but the Prime Minister sent his most trusted advisor and his clerk of the Privy Council to make it clear to the Minister that she had better obey or else. Minister Wilson-Raybould had more credibility than anyone in the PMO, and she didn't budge. For that reason, she was shuffled into Veterans Affairs, opening the position of Attorney General to David Lametti, who didn't have the same moral compass as Ms. Wilson-Raybould. He was just as happy to be in Cabinet. So he signed whatever paper the Prime Minister put in front of him. When this scandal became public, the Prime Minister claimed what is in the Globe and Mail is false. Of course it wasn't false. The Prime Minister lied and his office tried to ruin the reputation of Ms. Wilson-Raybould in the media.
Fair point of order. I can imagine what it's going to be. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, as you know, using the word lie is unparliamentary, and she should have been possibly edited out of her speech.
I'll just ask the Honourable Member from Renfrew Nipissing Pembroke to please withdraw that.
Yes, I withdraw that word. Thank you for pointing that out, my biggest fan in the Liberal government. To finish up with my colleague from the bloc, I think it's important that we drive the message home, making sure every Canadian who has tuned into Parliament or not hears from by word of mouth how corrupt this government is, and that we don't let another piece of business go until this has been addressed properly. And the only way to address it overall, so everyone has a say, is to have a carbon tax election now.
Questions and comments?
Let's call silence.
Mr. Speaker, and the Honourable Member for Renfrew Nipissing Pembroke may be surprised. I think that the chronology of events as she describes them is accurate, but with one exception. And I, as someone who is in the Green Party, not part, although the word Green gets thrown around as if we have something to do with this, obviously not. No word of dispute from me as to the chronology, except for this, that we don't know that the people who were put on that board had any connection to any political party at all. In fact, the chair of the board, who egregiously violated conflict of interest standards, was an advisor to Jim Flaherty, much admired former Minister of Finance under Stephen Harper, to Stephen Harper himself. In other words, like many people in business in Canada, this person seems to have made sure that they had favors with many different parties and weren't associated with anyone in particular.
The Honourable Member from Renfrew Nipissing Pembroke.
Okay, and so that member sticking up for the Liberals, propping them up, probably explains why during one of my constituency clinics in Renfrew, I had a couple come all the way from her riding to make an appointment to see me because they had grown up in Pembroke and they from time to time had, or in Renfrew, and from time to time had seen the writings that we had handed out to their family members, and they wanted to tell me firsthand that they want a Conservative riding represented where they live in her riding there. They want a Conservative to become elected, and they want her out, and this is the reason why.